The shelter was unusually quiet that evening. Rows of kennels lined the dimly lit hall, filled with animals waiting for their turn to be adopted or worse, forgotten. The metallic smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the faint, sorrowful whimpers of dogs who had long since given up on wagging their tails. Among them was a pit bull, his once strong frame now weak and trembling. His coat, which might have been a beautiful brown once, was patchy and dull. He barely lifted his head as a staff member walked past, carrying a clipboard with his fate sealed on it. The dog had no name, at least none he remembered. The shelter called him number 78, but the truth was clear: he didn't have much time left. Sick, abandoned, and misunderstood, he had become a burden no one wanted to carry. The pit bull had stopped expecting kindness, his world was a cold metal cage, and the occasional glance of pity from behind bars. But even that was rare. People rarely stopped for a pit bull. At the end of the row, a young girl hesitated. She wasn't like the others who had come through that day, looking for puppies with wagging tails and perfect coats. She was quiet, her eyes scanning each kennel with a strange mix of sadness and determination. Her gaze lingered on the pit bull's cage longer than the others, but she didn't approach right away. She just stood there, holding something small in her hands, a crumpled blanket. The staff member noticed her hesitation and approached with a forced smile. "That one's not for adoption," they said softly, almost apologetically. He's not doing well. It's better this way." The girl didn't respond at first. Her eyes stayed locked on the dog. She could see the way his ribs pressed against his skin, the way his breathing seemed labored, as if every breath was a battle. But what struck her most wasn't his frailty, it was his eyes. Even through the dullness of sickness and defeat, there was a flicker of something that hadn't completely given up. "Can I see him?" she finally asked, her voice steady but quiet. The staff member hesitated. "It's not a good idea. He's unpredictable. And besides..." Their voice trailed off, as if the reality of what was about to happen to the dog was too heavy to say out loud. But the girl didn't budge. "Please. Just for a moment." Reluctantly, the staff member unlocked the cage. The pit bull didn't move, didn't even lift his head, as if the sound of the opening door meant nothing to him anymore. But the girl didn't seem to notice. She stepped in carefully, kneeling just outside his reach. She didn't touch him right away, didn't rush to pet him like so many others had with other dogs. Instead, she simply sat, letting the blanket fall across her lap. "You're not as scary as they say, are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the shelter lights. The dog's ears twitched, just barely, but it was the only sign he'd even heard her. For what felt like an eternity, she stayed like that, just sitting there, her presence a quiet reassurance that she wasn't there to judge or to take pity. Minutes passed, and the girl did something no one else had bothered to do. She reached out, but not with her hand. She hummed a soft tune, one that seemed to wrap around the tiny space like a warm embrace. It wasn't a song anyone would recognize, it was raw, unpracticed, but it carried a sense of peace. The pit bull's head lifted slightly, his tired eyes meeting hers for the first time. That was when the staff member spoke up. "You should step out now. It's better not to get too attached." But the girl didn't move. Instead, she slowly unfolded the blanket she'd brought and placed it gently on the floor of the cage, just out of reach of the dog. Then, without a word, she stood and left. The staff members shook their head. "I don't know what you thought you'd accomplish, but that dog doesn't have much time left. It's not worth getting your hopes up." The girl didn't respond, but as she walked out of the shelter, there was something unshakable in her expression. She didn't see what the staff members saw. Where they saw a hopeless case, she saw something worth fighting for. The next day, she returned. This time, she brought something else, a small bowl of food, not the kind the shelter provided, but something homemade, the kind that smelled warm and inviting. She waited for permission again, and though the staff member sighed heavily, they allowed it. The girl repeated what she had done the day before, kneeling just outside the dog's reach. She didn't try to force anything, didn't try to make him eat right away. Instead, she hummed that same quiet tune, her presence calm and unthreatening. This time, the pit bull lifted his head a little higher. His nose twitched, catching the scent of the food she'd brought. Slowly, cautiously, he inched closer. He didn't eat much that day, just a few hesitant bites, but it was more than anyone had seen him do in days. And when she left the blanket and the empty bowl behind. For the next week, the girl came back every day. Each time, she brought something new, a soft toy, a gentle touch, a whispered word of encouragement. And each time, the pit bull responded a little more. His tail, which had once been lifeless, began to twitch. His eyes, once dull and defeated, started to shine with a glimmer of hope. The staff watched in disbelief. "I don't know what she's doing," one of them said, shaking their head. "But it's like he's a different dog." By the end of the week, the pit bull had a name. Not one the shelter gave him, but one the girl whispered to him every time she visited. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise that he was more than just a number, more than a statistic in a place that had already given up on him. But not everyone was convinced. "It doesn't change the fact that he's sick," another staff member argued. "She can't save him. Sometimes it's just too late." The girl didn't seem to hear those words. If she did, she didn't let them stop her. One evening, as the shelter prepared to close, she stayed a little longer than usual. The pit bull, now sitting up and alert, wagged his tail weakly as she knelt by his cage one last time. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised, her voice steady but filled with something that sounded almost like defiance. "You just hold on." That night, something remarkable happened. The pit bull, who had spent weeks barely moving, stood on his shaky legs and pulled the blanket she'd left him closer with his teeth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind the staff that maybe, just maybe, hope wasn't as lost as they thought. The girl returned the next morning, as she always did, but this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man, his expression hesitant but kind. He looked at the pit bull, then back at the girl, and for the first time, the staff realized what she had been working toward all along. "He's coming home with us," the girl said firmly, her hand resting gently on the man's arm. The staff hesitated. "Are you sure?" "He's still not well." "It's a big responsibility." The girl nodded. "I'm sure. He just needs a chance." As the papers were signed and the pit bull was carefully led out of the shelter, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, the dog's tail wagged with purpose. He didn't just survive, he began to live. The staff watched as the girl and her father drove away, the pit bull's head poking out of the car window, ears flapping in the wind. It was a sight none of them would forget, a testament to the power of kindness, determination, and the simple act of believing in something that others had given up on. And as the car disappeared into the distance, one of the staff members turned to the others and said quietly, "Maybe we were wrong about him after all." The drive home was quiet, but it carried a weight that neither the girl nor her father could ignore. In the back seat, the pit bull lay curled on the blanket she'd brought from the shelter, his breathing shallow but steady. Every now and then, his eyes flicked toward her, as though trying to understand why she'd chosen him when so many others had passed him by. Her father glanced at her from the driver's seat, breaking the silence. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" His tone wasn't harsh, just cautious. He'd seen how determined she'd been, but he also knew the challenges ahead. "He's sick. We don't even know how much time he has." She didn't look away from the dog. "It doesn't matter. He's not going to spend whatever time he has left in a cage. He deserves better than that." The pit bull shifted slightly, his body still frail but no longer completely lifeless. The girl smiled, just a little, as she saw the faintest glimmer of trust in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. When they arrived home, she carried him inside carefully, her father holding the door open. The dog didn't resist but seemed unsure of his new surroundings. He hesitated, his legs wobbling as she set him down on the soft bed she'd prepared in the corner of the living room. "This is your home now," she said softly, crouching down to his level. "You're safe here." Her father watched from a distance, leaning against the doorway. He wanted to believe in her optimism, but he couldn't help worrying. The dog was a pit bull, large, intimidating, and misunderstood by many. And beyond that, he was sick, his body weak from neglect and illness. It would take more than love to heal him. But the girl wasn't concerned about any of that. She'd spent weeks volunteering at the shelter, watching dog after dog find homes, and seeing too many like him left behind. She'd heard the whispers, the stereotypes, the warnings about pit bulls being dangerous or unpredictable. None of that mattered to her. What she saw wasn't a threat. She saw a soul that had been abandoned, forgotten, and left to suffer. And she wasn't going to let that be the end of his story. The first few days were hard. The dog barely ate, even when she brought him the same homemade meals he'd started to trust at the shelter. He spent most of his time curled on the blanket, his body too weak to move much. But every night she sat beside him, humming that same soft tune, her presence a quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone anymore. Her father tried to help in his own way. He brought home vitamins and supplements, researching everything he could about how to help a dog in such poor condition. He even scheduled an appointment with the vet, though he wasn't sure what they'd be able to do. "I just don't want you to get your hopes up," he told her one evening as they stood in the kitchen, the pit bull resting in the next room. "You're doing everything you can, but sometimes it's out of our hands." She didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't ready to give up, not now, not ever. The vet visit was another turning point. The pit bull, though timid and visibly nervous, allowed the doctor to examine him without much fuss. The diagnosis wasn't surprising: malnutrition, a respiratory infection, and signs of previous injuries that had never healed properly. The vet's expression was kind but cautious as she spoke. "With proper care, he might pull through," she said, handing over a list of medications and dietary recommendations. "But it's going to be a long road. He'll need patience, consistency, and, well, a lot of love." The girl nodded firmly. "He'll have all of that." True to her word, she dedicated herself to his recovery. She set alarms to remind herself of his medication schedule, cooked special meals to build his strength, and spent hours sitting with him, reading aloud or simply keeping him company. Slowly but surely, the pit bull began to change. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, started to brighten. His appetite returned, little by little, and his coat, though still patchy, began to regain its shine. He even wagged his tail more often, especially when she entered the room. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were setbacks: days when he refused to eat, nights when his breathing seemed more labored, and moments when his past traumas surfaced, in the form of flinches or sudden fear. The girl never got frustrated, though. She met every challenge with patience, her quiet determination never wavering. One evening, as she sat on the floor beside him, her father joined her. He handed her a cup of tea and lowered himself onto the couch, watching the dog with a curious expression. "You've done something incredible," he said after a while, his voice soft. "I didn't think he'd make it this far." She looked at the pit bull, who was now resting his head on her lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "He just needed someone to believe in him," she said simply. Her father nodded, though his expression grew serious. "You know, people aren't always going to see him the way you do. A lot of folks are scared of pit bulls. They won't care how sweet he is or how hard you've worked to help him." "I know," she replied. "But that's their loss." It wasn't long before the pit bull began to show glimpses of the dog he could have been if life had been kinder to him. He followed her around the house, his tail wagging steadily, and even started to play with the toys she'd brought home. His strength returned, slowly but surely, and with it came a sense of confidence that had been missing for so long. But there was still a shadow hanging over them, a lingering question of whether his past had left scars too deep to heal. The girl knew there were things she couldn't change, no matter how hard she tried. She couldn't erase the years of neglect, the pain he'd endured, or the way the world had treated him before he'd found his way to her. One day, as she walked him through the neighborhood, a woman crossed to the other side of the street, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the pit bull. The girl felt a pang of frustration, but she kept her head high, offering a small smile to the woman despite the clear judgment in her gaze. Her father's warnings echoed in her mind, but she pushed them aside. She wasn't going to let other people's fears define her dog's future. That night, as she sat beside him on the couch, she whispered, "You're not what they think you are. You're brave, and strong, and kind. And I'll make sure everyone sees that." The pit bull looked up at her, his eyes filled with a trust that hadn't been there before. He didn't understand her words, but he felt the truth behind them. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. But as the days turned into weeks, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, obstacles she couldn't predict, and a world full of people who might never see him the way she did. Yet, as she watched him sleep that night, his body rising and falling with each steady breath, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to give up on him. Not now, not ever. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the wind howled softly, carrying with it the promise of both trials and triumphs. But inside the small, warm house, there was only peace, a peace hard-earned and fiercely protected, a peace that came from the unbreakable bond between a girl and the dog she refused to give up on. The weeks rolled by, and the pit bull continued to grow stronger. His coat had a shine to it now, his muscles filled out little by little, and his energy returned. He wagged his tail more often and started to greet the girl at the door when she came home from school, his excitement clear in his every movement. The once fragile dog had transformed into a companion full of life and gratitude. Still, there were moments when his past crept back in, casting shadows over his newfound joy. One afternoon, as they walked along their usual path in the park, a sudden noise startled him, a sharp, metallic clang from a dropped bike nearby. His body froze, his ears pinned back, and his breathing quickened. The girl knelt beside him immediately, her hand resting gently on his back. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice calm and steady. "You're safe. I'm here." It took a moment, but eventually, he leaned into her touch, his trembling easing. She could feel the fear lingering in him, a ghost of the life he'd lived before. It wasn't the first time she'd seen him react this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But she also knew he was trying, and that was enough for her. The next day, she decided to take him somewhere new, a bustling street market where people gathered to shop and socialize. She wanted to show him a world beyond the quiet park and their safe, familiar neighborhood. But as soon as they arrived, she realized it might have been too much too soon. The crowd was overwhelming, the noise relentless, and the scents unfamiliar. The pit bull stayed close to her side, his leash taut as he tried to process everything around him. People stared as they passed, some stepping aside to give them a wide berth. She overheard whispers, comments about how she was brave or reckless for bringing a dog like that to such a busy place. Her stomach tightened, but she kept walking, her hand resting on his head as a silent reassurance. She refused to let their judgments shake her. This was part of his journey, part of proving that he was more than what people assumed. But then, something unexpected happened. A young boy, no older than 6 or 7, approached them with a wide smile. He held out a small piece of bread, his eyes shining with curiosity. "Can I give it to him?" he asked, looking up at her. She hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the pit bull. His body was tense, his gaze fixed on the boy. But there was no aggression in his eyes, only uncertainty. She nodded. "Hold your hand out flat," she instructed softly. The boy did as she said, and to her relief, the pit bull leaned forward cautiously, sniffing the bread before taking it gently from his hand. The boy giggled, clapping his hands in delight. "He's so nice!" he exclaimed before running back to his parents, who watched from a distance. The girl felt a swell of pride. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. For the first time, someone outside of her and her father had seen the pit bull for who he truly was, a kind, gentle soul who just needed a chance. But not everyone was as open-minded. Later that evening, as they walked home, a man approached them on the sidewalk. He stopped in front of them, his expression stern. "You should keep that dog on a shorter leash," he said, his tone sharp. "Those things are dangerous. You never know when they'll snap." The girl's heart raced, anger bubbling up inside her. She wanted to defend her dog, to explain how far he'd come and how wrong the man was. But she could see the fear in his eyes, the deep-seated prejudice that wouldn't be swayed by words. She tightened her grip on the leash, nodded politely, and walked away. That night, as she sat with the pit bull in their living room, she couldn't shake the man's words. They echoed in her mind, threatening to chip away at the confidence she'd built. But then she looked at her dog, his head resting on her lap, his eyes filled with trust. She knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. Still, the encounter left her unsettled. She realized that no matter how much love and care she gave him, the world might never fully accept him. There would always be those who saw him as a threat, who judged him without knowing his story. And that thought weighed heavily on her heart. A week later, she decided to push their boundaries again. There was a community event at the park, a gathering for local pet owners to meet, share stories, and show off their furry companions. She thought it would be a good opportunity for the pit bull to interact with others, to prove that he could be part of a larger community. As they arrived, she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The park was alive with activity dogs of all shapes and sizes running, barking, and playing, their owners chatting and laughing nearby. She kept the pit bull close to her side, watching for any signs of distress. To her relief, he seemed calm, his tail wagging slightly as he took in the scene. But not everyone welcomed them. As they approached a group of dog owners, one woman stepped back, pulling her small dog closer. "Is he safe?" she asked, her tone wary. The girl forced a smile. "He's perfectly safe," she said firmly. "He's just here to make friends like everyone else." The pit bull, unaware of the tension, wagged his tail again and sniffed the air. The woman didn't look convinced, but she didn't say anything else. The girl tried to focus on the positives. A few people came up to them, asking about the pit bull's story and commenting on how well behaved he was. One man even reached out to pet him, and the dog leaned into his touch, his eyes closing in contentment. But then, out of nowhere, a loud commotion erupted nearby. Two dogs had gotten into a scuffle, their barks sharp and aggressive. The noise startled the pit bull, and he jumped, his body tense. The girl crouched beside him immediately, her hand on his chest. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're okay." The scuffle was broken up quickly, but the damage was done. People were looking at them now, their expressions wary. She could feel their judgment, their assumptions about her dog. One person whispered loudly, "It's always the pit bulls. You can't trust them." Her heart sank. She wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She stood up, her hands still on the pit bull's leash, and started to walk away. But as they reached the edge of the park, something unexpected happened. A little girl ran up to them, her parents trailing behind. She held out a small flower, her face bright with innocence. "For him," she said, placing the flower gently in the pit bull's collar. The pit bull sniffed the flower, then looked up at the girl, his tail wagging. It was a small moment, but it felt like a triumph, a reminder that not everyone judged him unfairly, that there were still people willing to see him for who he truly was. The girl smiled, her heart swelling with hope. They weren't at the end of their journey yet, but moments like this made her believe they could get there. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the days passed, the girl began to notice subtle changes in the pit bull's behavior. While he had grown stronger and more confident in familiar settings, there were moments when he seemed distracted, almost restless. He would sit by the window for hours, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were searching for something or someone. At night, his once peaceful sleep was interrupted by quiet whimpers and the occasional low growl. She couldn't help but wonder if his past was still haunting him, if there were pieces of his story she hadn't yet uncovered. One evening, as they walked their usual route, the pit bull suddenly froze. His ears perked up, his body tense, and a low rumble escaped his throat. The girl followed his gaze and saw a figure in the distance, a man leaning against a car, watching them intently. There was something unsettling about his posture, the way his eyes seemed to linger on the dog. The pit bull didn't bark or lunge, but he didn't move either, his stance protective. The girl tightened her grip on the leash and quickened her pace, her heart pounding. She tried to shake off the feeling of unease, convincing herself it was just a coincidence. But as they turned the corner, she glanced back and saw the man still standing there, his gaze following them. It was enough to send a shiver down her spine. That night, as they settled in for bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? Why had he been watching them? And why had the pit bull reacted so strongly to him? She tried to push the questions aside, telling herself it was probably nothing. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, she decided to take a different route for their walk. She wanted to avoid the park and the usual streets, just in case. But as they rounded a quiet corner near an old warehouse, the pit bull stopped again, his ears twitching. This time, he let out a sharp bark, his body stiff and alert. The girl scanned the area, her eyes darting between the shadows, but she didn't see anyone. "Come on," she said softly, trying to coax him forward. But he wouldn't budge. Instead, he pulled on the leash, leading her toward the side of the building. She hesitated, unsure if she should follow, but his determination was undeniable. Reluctantly, she let him guide her, her heart racing with every step. As they approached the corner of the warehouse, she heard a faint sound, like a muffled cry. Her breath caught in her throat. She crouched down beside the pit bull, her hand resting on his back for reassurance. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Peering around the corner, she saw them, a small group of people huddled near the back entrance of the warehouse. They were speaking in hushed tones, their movements hurried. Among them was the man from the previous night. He was holding something in his hand, but from this distance, she couldn't make out what it was. Her instinct told her to turn around and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But before she could move, the pit bull let out another bark, louder this time. The group turned in unison, their eyes locking onto her. Panic surged through her veins as the man took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Hey!" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tightened her grip on the leash and backed away slowly. The pit bull stood his ground, his gaze fixed on the man, his body a shield between her and the group. "You shouldn't be here," the man said again, his tone sharp. "It's not safe." The girl's mind raced. What did he mean? Was it a warning or a threat? She didn't wait to find out. Turning on her heel, she broke into a run, the pit bull keeping pace beside her. She didn't stop until they were back on the main road, the safety of streetlights and passing cars calming her racing heart. When they finally reached home, she locked the door and sank to the floor, her back against the wall. The pit bull sat beside her, his head resting on her shoulder as if to say, "It's okay. You're safe now." but she didn't feel safe. The encounter had left her shaken, and the questions swirling in her mind only grew louder. Who were those people? What were they doing? And why did the man seem to recognize the pit bull? Over the next few days, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Cars she didn't recognize seemed to linger near her house, and strangers on the street seemed to pay more attention to her and the pit bull than usual. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a result of the encounter at the warehouse. But the pit bull's behavior told her otherwise. He was more alert than ever, his ears constantly twitching, his eyes scanning their surroundings with a sharp intensity. One evening, as she was brushing his coat, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a faint scar on the inside of his ear. It was small and barely visible, but it looked deliberate, almost like a mark. Her fingers traced the line, her mind racing. Could it be connected to his past? Was it a clue to where he had come from and what he had endured? She decided to dig deeper. Late that night, after the pit bull had fallen asleep, she searched online for anything that might explain the scar. She found articles about rescue dogs, stories of animals saved from cruel conditions, and even reports of illegal dog fighting rings. The thought made her stomach turn. Was that what he had been a part of? Was that why he was so scarred, both physically and emotionally? The more she read, the more pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place. But with each revelation, her unease grew. If he had been part of something illegal, could the people at the warehouse have been involved? And if so, had they recognized him? The next day, she decided to visit the shelter where she had first found him. She hoped they might have more information, something that could help her understand what she was dealing with. But when she arrived, the staff were reluctant to share much. They told her the pit bull had been brought in anonymously, his history unknown. "It's not uncommon," one of the staff members said gently. "A lot of these dogs come to us with no background. We do our best to care for them and find them loving homes, but sometimes their pasts catch up with them." The words sent a chill down her spine. Was that what was happening now? Was his past catching up with him? And if so, what would that mean for both of them? As she left the shelter, the pit bull by her side, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, her instincts told her to stay on guard. Back at home, she closed all the curtains and double-checked the locks on the doors. The pit bull seemed to sense her unease, sticking close to her as she moved around the house. That night she barely slept, her mind racing with questions and fears. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, how far would she go to protect the dog who had already changed her life in so many ways? The night was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made every creak and groan of the house sound amplified. The girl sat on the couch with the pit bull curled at her feet, his head resting on her lap. She tried to focus on the book in her hands, but her eyes kept darting toward the window. Something about the silence felt wrong, as if the world outside was holding its breath. Then, a sound broke the quiet: a faint tapping at the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a knock, but more like someone testing the door, trying to be discreet. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The pit bull's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, his body immediately alert. He didn't bark, but the low growl rumbling in his chest sent chills through her. The tapping stopped, replaced by the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. Someone was definitely there. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed the emergency number. As the operator answered, she whispered her address and explained what was happening, her voice barely audible over her racing heartbeat. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the pit bull bolted to the door, his growl turning into a sharp bark. The girl followed him, her hands shaking as she peeked through the peephole. At first, she saw nothing but darkness, and then a figure stepped into view. It was the man from the warehouse. He was standing just a few feet from the door, his face partially obscured by a hood. In his hand, he held what looked like a leash. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. What did he want? Why was he here? The pit bull barked again, louder this time, his body pressed against the door as if he were ready to break through it. The man took a step closer, and through the peephole, she saw his lips move. He was saying something, but she couldn't make out the words. The sound of sirens in the distance made her stomach unclench slightly. Relief flooded her as she realized the police were on their way. But then the man did something unexpected. He dropped the leash and held up his hands, as if to show he wasn't a threat. His lips moved again, and this time she pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, his voice muffled but calm. I just need to see him. The words sent a jolt through her. He was talking about the pit bull. She stayed silent, her mind racing. What was his connection to the dog? And why was he so determined to find him? The sirens grew louder, and blue and red lights flashed through the curtains. The man stepped back, his hands still raised. When the police arrived, he didn't resist. He calmly explained that he wasn't there to cause harm, but his vague answers about why he was there only deepened the mystery. One of the officers approached her, asking if she was okay. She nodded, still shaken, and pointed to the pit bull. He said he needed to see my dog. I don't know why. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before asking the man more questions. Finally, the man sighed and said, the dog. He's mine. Or at least, he used to be. I lost him a long time ago. I've been trying to find him ever since. The words hit her like a thunderclap. She looked down at the pit bull, who was still standing protectively in front of her. Could it be true? Could this man really be part of the dog's past? The officers were skeptical, but the man insisted he had proof. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a picture of a younger version of the pit bull, wearing the same scar on his ear. The girl's heart twisted. It was undeniable. The dog had once belonged to him. But as she looked at the photo, she noticed something strange. The dog's expression in the picture was different, tense, fearful, nothing like the confident, happy dog she had come to know. The man noticed her hesitation and sighed. I know how it looks, he said. But I didn't hurt him. I saved him. He was part of something bad, something I was trying to stop. That scar? It's a tracker. They used it to keep tabs on him and others like him. When I found out, I tried to get him out, but things went wrong. He ran, and I couldn't find him. I thought he was gone forever. The pit bull let out a soft whine, as if he recognized the man's voice. The girl felt a lump form in her throat. Was the man telling the truth? She wanted to believe him, but the weight of the past hung heavily in the air. The officers decided to take the man in for further questioning, leaving her with more questions than answers. As they drove away, she sat on the floor with the pit bull, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. What happened to you? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. The next day, she received a call from the police. They had verified the man's story. He had been part of an undercover operation to dismantle a dog fighting ring, and the pit bull had been one of the animals he had tried to save. But when the operation was exposed, he had been forced to go into hiding, leaving the dogs behind. The revelation brought a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude that the pit bull had found his way to her. But it also raised a difficult question: should she let him go back to the man who had once tried to save him? That evening the man returned, this time with the police as witnesses. He knelt on the porch, holding out his hand as the pit bull approached cautiously. The girl watched with bated breath as the dog sniffed the man's hand, his tail wagging slightly. It was a moment of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. But then, something remarkable happened. The pit bull turned back to the girl, his eyes locking with hers. It was as if he was making a choice, a decision about where he truly belonged. The man smiled softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's yours now," he said, his voice breaking. "You've given him a new life, a better one than I ever could. Just promise me you'll take care of him." The girl nodded, her own tears spilling over. "I will," she said. "I promise." As the man walked away, the pit bull pressed against her side, his warmth a comforting reminder that they had both found something they didn't know they were searching for: family. And in that moment, she realized the twist wasn't just in the dog's past or the man's story. It was in her own heart, in the way she had been transformed by a dog who was so much more than a rescue. He was a survivor, a fighter, and a reminder that sometimes, second chances come when we least expect them. The days following that emotional evening were quiet but full of meaning. The girl and the pit bull fell into a comfortable routine, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Though the shadow of his past lingered in her mind, she chose not to dwell on it. What mattered was the present, the life they were building together. The dog, once wary of strangers and sudden movements, now walked confidently at her side, tail wagging as they explored. The neighborhood news of the pit bull's story began to spread. A local journalist had caught wind of the events and reached out to the girl, wanting to share her journey. At first, she hesitated. The idea of being in the spotlight felt overwhelming, and she worried about how the pit bull might react. But then she thought about the other animals out there, those still trapped in lives of neglect and fear, and decided it was a chance to make a difference. The article was published a week later, its headline reading, "A Second Chance, the dog who overcame his past and found love." The story highlighted the dog's journey, from his harrowing beginnings to the safe, loving home he now enjoyed. It also shed light on the broader issue of animal cruelty, urging readers to support local shelters and rescue organizations. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers, some sharing their own rescue stories, others simply expressing their gratitude for the girl's kindness. Donations to the local shelter spiked, and more people came forward to adopt. It was a ripple effect sparked by one dog's remarkable resilience and the love of the person who refused to give up on him. But amidst the positivity, there were moments of reflection. One evening, as the girl sat on the porch with the pit bull at her feet, she found herself thinking about the man. She had expected anger or bitterness when he walked away, but instead, he had given them his blessing. It was a rare kind of grace, one that spoke of his own struggles and redemption. She hoped he had found peace, wherever he was. The pit bull, sensing her mood, nudged her hand with his nose. She smiled, rubbing his ears. "You're happy, aren't you?" she asked softly. His response was a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he leaned into her touch. She felt a pang of gratitude so deep it almost hurt. This dog, once discarded and broken, had taught her more about love and resilience than she could have imagined. Life continued, and with it came small but meaningful milestones. The pit bull began to thrive, his coat growing shinier, his scars fading into faint reminders of his past. He became a favorite at the local park, where other dog owners marveled at his gentle demeanor. Children would run up to pet him, their laughter ringing through the air as he wagged his tail and licked their hands. The girl, too, found herself changed. She began volunteering at the shelter, using her story to inspire others. She helped with adoption events, spoke to groups about the importance of giving animals a second chance, and even started fostering dogs in need. Each new face brought its own challenges, but she faced them with the same determination she had shown the pit bull. Her home became a place of healing, a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go. One day, as she was sorting through old photos, she came across the picture the man had given her, the one of the pit bull as a younger dog. She stared at it for a long time, her heart aching for the version of him that had endured so much. As she looked down at the happy, healthy dog snoozing at her feet, she felt a surge of pride. He had come so far, and so had she. The seasons changed, and with them came new challenges and joys. The pit bull, now a senior dog, began to slow down. His walks became shorter, his naps longer, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. The girl adapted, cherishing every moment they had together. She knew their time was limited, but instead of dwelling on the inevitable, she focused on making memories. They visited the beach, where he barked at the waves and dug his paws into the sand. They explored quiet trails, where he sniffed every tree and watched the birds with quiet curiosity. Each day felt like a gift, a reminder of how far they had come. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the girl and the pit bull sat together in the backyard. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. The dog rested his head in her lap, his breathing slow and steady. She ran her fingers through his fur, her heart full. "I hope you know how much you've changed my life," she whispered, her voice trembling. The pit bull opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. In that moment, she felt a connection so profound it was as if he understood every word. As the years passed, the girl continued her work with rescue animals, her home always open to those in need. The pit bull remained a constant presence, his story inspiring countless others to take a chance on animals with difficult pasts. When the time finally came to say goodbye, it was peaceful and filled with love. The girl held him close, whispering words of gratitude as he slipped away, leaving behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. In the end, the pit bull's story was not just about survival or redemption. It was about the power of love, the strength of second chances, and the unbreakable bond between a girl and her dog. And though he was gone, his spirit lived on in every life he had touched, hers most of all.